The Talmud tells the tale of the yeshiva student who was overwhelmed with the desire to meet a certain very illustrious prostitute. He sent a large sum of money to pay in advance for his meeting, 400 pieces of gold, and made a long journey to meet the lady. When he finally arrived, he's ushered into the room, and in the room there are 7 beds on top of each other with 6 ladders linking up the 7 beds. And on the top bed is sitting the lady. He climbs up the ladders, and when he gets to the top, he's about to sin, and suddenly his tzitzit slap him on the face, and that slap brings him back to his senses, and slowly he goes and descends those ladders that he just went up. And when he gets to the bottom, the lady on the top is quite surprised and even quite insulted. She climbs down right after him and says, "What's wrong with me? Why have you rejected me?" And he tells her, "No, you're indeed the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." But then he tells her about the tzitzit. And he tells her about God that he remembered when slapped by the tzitzit, and about the Torah, and explains to her that despite her great beauty, why he's about to leave her. Until now, this would be a typical story of the genre of somebody who in merit of a mitzvah that he's done is prevented from doing a sin. But now the continuation of the story is filled with surprises. And among other things, we discover that the hero of the story is not only the yeshiva student, but the lady as well. The lady insists that he writes down his name and the yeshiva that he studies at and the name of his rabbi. He writes it, gives it to her, he leaves her, goes back to the yeshiva, immerses himself in the study of Torah. Then she goes, she sells everything she has. Part of it she gives to bribes so that she could leave where she is. Part of it to charity. And then she goes in search of the yeshiva student. And surprisingly, what she chooses to take with her are the 7 beds and the ladders connecting them. And I would think that would be the first thing that she would leave behind. The tools of her trade that so much she wants now to leave and start a new life. But she takes those beds and goes in search of the yeshiva student. She meets his rabbi, tells him the story, and the rabbi tells her that he's willing to convert her, to accept her as a convert to Judaism, and then reflecting to the upcoming marriage of this lady and his student, he blesses their marriage and includes that the beds that were previously used for sin will now be used in the context of their marriage relationship. So we have a surprising twist to the story, and to understand the story, the key, I believe, is understanding the role of the beds. As I mentioned, there are 7 beds that are linked by 6 ladders. And the numbers here are very exact, because the Talmud teaches us that tzitzit should have 13 bands wound around them. 7 of them blue, and 6 of them white. The 7 blue to reflect the 7 heavens, and the 6 white to reflect the ear connecting them. I could try to demonstrate. And clearly there's a contrast between the commandment of tzitzit, with the 7 heavens and the 6 white between them, and the 7 beds with the 6 ladders between them. We have a contrast between sanctity, holiness, and tumah, and sin. And therefore it even more highlights the role of the beds and their transformance between the beds representing the sin and the beds ultimately becoming part of the covenant of marriage between the lady and the yeshiva student. Now, in the flow of the story, I think can be understood with a concept taught by the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidut. The Baal Shem Tov taught that there are 3 stages that a person relates to his Yetzer. Yetzer refers to the desires, the inclinations inside of each person. Sometimes called Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, but often it's referred to as Yetzer. And the Yetzer in Hebrew is connected to the word Yitzirah, which is creativity, reflecting that the Yetzer itself, the different desires and inclinations inside a person, are not evil in themselves, but can be used, often makes one turn to evil. And the Baal Shem Tov teaches that in relating to the Yetzer, there are 3 stages. The first stage, we have to do Hachna'ah. Hachna'ah of the Yetzer. Hachna'ah would mean to overcome the Yetzer. And there's a struggle between us and our inner desires and Yetzer. In that struggle, we must overcome the Yetzer. The second part, the second stage, he calls Hafradah, separation. After the conflict that we have succeeded in defeating, overcoming the Yetzer, we must separate ourselves from the Yetzer. Because if we may have defeated the Yetzer, but we still haven't achieved a mastery of the Yetzer that allows us to stay close to it, because today we've defeated the Yetzer, tomorrow maybe he will defeat us. And the third step is after we've defeated it, after we've managed to separate ourselves from the Yetzer, we now have we have the power to master our desires, and then we can achieve the third state, which he calls Hamtaka, which would be literally translated as sweetening, which he calls to uplift and sanctify the Yetzer. Those powerful forces inside of us, instead of having them controlling us, instead of having them taking us to evil, we now embrace these forces and uplift them for good, and bring them to holiness. And these are the 3 stages in the story. The first part of the story, the student manages to overcome and defeat those forces inside of him that were taking him to sin. In the second stage, he separates himself from what those desires represent, the connection with that particular woman, and in fact the Hebrew or Aramaic says that when he writes down his name, information about himself, katav v'natanla. He wrote it and gave it to her, which are the same words used for the Torah to describe the giving of a get, the giving of the document of divorce between a man and a woman. And after that separation, we get to the third part of the story, and the third part of the story is the Hamtaka. The third part of the story is taking those forces that were being taken to evil, the connection between him and that woman, and now those forces will be part of the sanctity of their connection in matrimony. And in fact, this process itself is reflected in the chapter that tells us of the commandment that appears in our parsha of Tzitzit itself. Because in that chapter about Tzitzit, there seems to be a few verses that are repetitive. Because twice it tells us that when we see the tzitzit, we will remember and do the commandments of God. However, the first time it says we will see the tzitzit and remember and do the mitzvot of God. It says, as opposed to straying after our eyes and our heart. The first time we meet the remembering and doing the commandments of God, it's about turning away from evil, from doing negative things. But then afterwards, later in the chapter, talking about the tzitzit, it tells us that we will remember and do the commandments, and we will be holy to God. In the second stage, we are not removing ourselves from the negative, but we are becoming sanctified and attaching ourselves to God. And that's why, as the Shelach explains, that in the first part of the chapter, when it says that we will remember and do the mitzvot of God, we relate to God in the third person. In the second part of the chapter, God tells us, you remember and do my mitzvot. Here God is talking directly to us. God is not a third person, distant. God is directly relating to us, responding to us. So in the way to God, in the first stage, we are removing ourselves from evil. And in that place, God is a goal. But still a third person. But ultimately, after this process, we are privileged to become close to God, to become sanctified, and respond to God, relate to God, face to face, person to divine. Shabbat Shalom.